beneath the surface. Addiction doesn't start with a substance. It starts with a feeling, a quiet ache, a restlessness behind the eyes, a subtle trembling under the surface of your life, the kind you learn to ignore. Carl Jung once said, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism." He believed addiction was never about the substance, but about what it replaces. In Buddhism, this ache is called tanha, craving, the root of all suffering, a thirst that grows not from physical hunger, but from a spiritual drought, a separation from presence, from being. Christian mystics called it disordered love. When we direct our longing toward things that cannot satisfy the soul, the false idol, the golden calf, the endless wanting of the ego. And psychology, in its most honest moments, sees addiction not as disease, but as strategy, a method to survive what once felt unbearable. Abuse, neglect, loneliness, a deep, invisible wound covered in habit. Addiction is not limited to the extreme. It can live quietly, under polished routines and smiling faces. It can look like ambition, like control, like success. But underneath it all is the same hunger, to escape, to soothe, to silence something inside. Something old, something we haven't dared to face. And so we return, again and again, to the object. Not because it heals, but because it distracts us from the truth we are afraid to remember. This video is not about addiction in the way you've heard it before. It's about the part of you that knows, intuitively, that something is being avoided. We will not start with the substance. We will instead start with this: the wound that never had a name. Addiction rarely looks like what we think it is. We imagine chaos, rock bottom, desperation, but it often begins in silence, in the tiny fractures of a life that looked perfectly fine on the outside. Behind every addiction is a wound, but not always the kind you can name. Sometimes it's not trauma that breaks you. It's the absence of something that should have been there. Warmth, safety, welcome, a sense of being held by life instead of bracing against it. Studies in trauma psychology have found that people with addiction histories are overwhelmingly likely to have experienced emotional neglect, early attachment wounds, or chronic invalidation. Not just what was done to them, but what wasn't. Psychologists have found again and again, when the nervous system grows up in survival mode, it clings to anything that mimics relief. Even if it poisons you slowly, even if it disconnects you further. If it soothes, it stays. But soothing isn't healing, it's quiet, but not the kind that brings peace. It's the stillness of something being pushed down, not let go. Carl Jung saw addiction as a symptom of spiritual displacement, a failed search for meaning, for wholeness, for home. And the mystics understood this long before psychology did. In the book of Exodus, there's a moment. Just after the Israelites are freed from slavery, they've escaped Egypt, they've crossed the sea, but Moses disappears into the mountain to speak with God. And in the absence of direction, of presence, what do the people do? They melt their gold, and they build a false god, a golden calf. Because they are afraid, because they need something to hold, because it's easier to worship what you can see than to wait for what is real. That's addiction, not moral failure, but the instinct to find something solid when your soul is still trembling from everything it's lost. We don't build statues anymore. We build habits, cycles, dependencies. We craft our own golden calves. From the bottle, from the screen, from the performance of being okay. And all the while, something deeper waits, not to punish you, not to shame you, but to ask, what is it you truly long for that none of this has given you? What you're really reaching for. You think you're reaching for a drink, or a cigarette, or whatever it is for you that you're imagining in your head right now. But what you're really reaching for is something else entirely. Addiction is rarely about the thing itself. It's a symbol, a surrogate, a ritual to cope with a hunger you haven't yet named. When the tension rises, when the silence grows loud, when the weight in your chest begins to ache, you reach. Not because you want the thing, but because you want what it promises. Relief, control, warmth, escape. It could be anything. Some reach for food, for sugar, for nicotine. Others reach for productivity, for perfectionism, for the high of being praised. And others reach for people, the chase, the sex, the validation, the sense that maybe this time they won't leave. But behind each of these cravings is a deeper truth. You're not reaching outward. You're reaching inward, grasping blindly for the part of yourself that went missing, the part you buried. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche we exile. Not because it's evil, but because it was inconvenient, too vulnerable, too angry, too loud, too sensitive. So we hid it. And now, every addiction is a strategy to avoid looking at what's hiding there. The shadow isn't just your darkness, it's your unlived life, your shame, your grief, your hunger, your helplessness, your unmet need to scream or sob or ask why no one held you when you needed it most. And because you won't look at it, you repeat it again and again, unconsciously. Addiction becomes the loop that keeps you safe from your own depth. But there is no freedom without confrontation, no healing without exposure. What you're really reaching for is wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness, to be allowed to feel what you were taught to silence, to integrate what you were trained to reject. The cigarette is a breath you don't know how to take. The drink is a release you haven't learned to feel safely. The scroll is a refusal to sit in your own presence. The relationship is a plea to be seen by someone, anyone, because you're still unable to see yourself. None of these make you weak. They make you human. But they also point to something sacred. Every addiction is a doorway, not to shame, but to the shadow, and only by entering it, by naming what you've hidden, can you begin to reclaim the self you've been chasing through substitutes. Now, perhaps you don't even have a clear grasp on what this substitute is for you. This is what we'll cover in the next section. The silent addictions. Maybe you think addiction doesn't apply to you. You don't drink too much, you don't smoke, you've never touched a needle. But addiction isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle, civilized, polished. Sometimes it looks like a life full of motion, but no presence. A day packed with stimulation, but no meaning. The truth is, most people today are addicted to something. Not because they're weak, but because they're afraid of stopping. Because silence has become unbearable. And so, they fill it. With podcasts, with music, with endless scrolling, with back-to-back productivity. Always one step ahead of the voice inside them that's trying to speak. We call it being busy. We call it being informed. But what it really is avoidance, disguised as engagement. Noise has become a drug. Not the kind that puts you to sleep, but the kind that keeps you just awake enough to miss what matters. You walk around with headphones in, not because you need sound, but because you can't be alone with your own. You scroll, not because you're curious, but because you're restless. You're afraid of the moment when the feed ends and there's nothing left to distract you from the fact that you don't know how to be with yourself. And underneath all of it, the shadow waits. That buried part of you you've been running from, not because it's monstrous, but because it's honest, because it remembers what you tried to forget. And every time the silence starts to return, every time life begins to slow down enough to feel real, you reach for something, anything. The philosopher Pascal once wrote, All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He didn't mean boredom. He meant confrontation. He meant presence. And he was right. Because in that silence, there is no buffer, no filter. You have to feel what you've postponed. You have to look at what you've abandoned. And you have to realize that maybe, just maybe, you've been avoiding yourself this entire time. Not through vice, but through volume. Stillness is not emptiness. It is invitation. But first, you have to stop running. The stories you tell the world. You've spent so long justifying it to yourself that you almost believe your own story. You tell people you have it under control. You tell yourself it's not that bad. You joke about it. You dress it up with irony, intelligence, humor. But behind all of it, you know, the excuses are nonsense. The justifications are clever, yes, but see-through. You say, I just like to relax, or everyone's got their thing, or it's not like I do it all the time. You say it because it lets you delay the moment of truth, but that moment is coming. Because your body knows, your nervous system knows. The people closest to you, they know. They feel it in the pauses, in your eyes when you're tired, in your voice when you say you're fine. And the worst part? You're not hiding it. You're just surrounded by people who are doing the same thing. So no one calls it out. No one wants the mirror held up. And you mistake that silence for permission. But silence isn't approval. It's just mutual fear. Most people reject the truth of their addiction in one of two ways. First, they treat it like a secret. They tuck it into corners, use euphemisms, laugh it off. They know something's off. But looking too closely would mean changing, would mean grieving, would mean admitting they lost control. So they don't. Second, they fuse with it. They become the addiction. This is just who I am. It's my personality. I've always been like this. It's not even a flaw anymore. It's an identity badge. This is what the ego does when it feels threatened. It protects the addiction because the addiction has become a way to survive. If it dies, something inside you fears you'll die too. Carl Jung knew this pattern well. He believed the ego resists change not because it's irrational, but because it's terrified. It believes the addiction is necessary. And when a person fuses their identity with a wound, they'll fight to keep it, even when it's destroying them, even when it's obvious. And that's the cruel trick of the mind. It convinces you you're fine, that it's manageable, that you're still in control. You're not. And the longer you keep lying to yourself, the more energy it will drain from your life. You can dress it up. You can intellectualize it. You can spiritualize it even. But the truth is, if something has power over you, and you keep reaching for it even when it hurts you, you're not free. Now let's discuss genuine ways to stop using these stories as an emotional shield. How to rid of the narrative. You've seen the habit. You've heard the voice that justifies it. You've watched yourself reach again and again for something that doesn't work. And maybe you've tried to stop. Maybe you've gone days, weeks, even months without it. But it still lives under your skin. The pull, the urge, the ache. Because addiction isn't just about the behavior. It's about what the behavior protects you from. You can quit the surface, but if you don't face what's underneath, it comes back. Or it shapeshifts. It finds a new outlet. This is why discipline alone doesn't set you free. Because the root isn't willpower, it's avoidance. Carl Jung taught that we are haunted by the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The shadow, the abandoned self, the version of you that felt too much, wanted too much, feared too much, and was told to disappear. And disappear it did. But not forever. It waits. Behind the habit, behind the craving, behind the self you present to the world. That is what you're really avoiding. Not just pain, but the truth of who you are when the armor falls off. The grief you never sat with, the anger you swallowed, the loneliness you disguised as independence. Until you face this, until you meet the shadow and choose to see it instead of run, you will always find something else to cling to, something else to chase, to consume, to distract. And yet the answer isn't punishment. It isn't shame. It isn't some cold version of sobriety. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It's connection. Connection to what is real. To other people, yes, but more than that. To your own depth. To the part of you that feels, that remembers, that grieves, that hopes. The part of you that was never broken, only buried. Addiction is what happens when connection fails, and healing begins when you stop trying to kill the symptom and start listening to what it's pointing toward. Because no substance, no relationship, no identity will ever fill the space left by your refusal to meet yourself. The breaking point and the opening. There comes a moment where the craving doesn't work anymore. Not because you've conquered it, but because it's hollow. The pleasure is still there, but the relief is gone. The lie is too thin now. You reach for it out of habit, and when it lands, you feel nothing. That's the breaking point, the moment you realize you can't go forward and you can't go back. You're standing at the edge of something ancient. It feels like despair, but it's actually the first breath of truth. This is where most people turn around. They relapse. They distract. They numb. Not because they're weak, but because this moment is terrifying, because for the first time, they're not just losing the addiction, they're losing the identity built around it. The old self is crumbling, and the ego screams because it believes that if this dies, so do you. But it's not death, it's excavation. The false layers are falling away so the real can finally emerge. The Buddhists call this dukkha, the deep discomfort of being alive, fully alive, without sedatives. The Stoics called it fortitude, holding your ground in the presence of pain. And the mystics called it initiation, the descent into darkness that reveals the divine. You are not being punished, you are being pulled inward, and it hurts, not because you are broken, but because you are healing, because you are finally feeling what you've postponed. All the grief, all the rage, all the fear, it rises, it floods, and this time you don't run, you don't grab the drink, you don't open the app. You sit, you shake, you stay. And slowly, the storm begins to speak. You realize you're not being destroyed. You're being shown what was always underneath, the part of you that never needed the addiction to begin with. And for the first time, something cracks open, not a high, not a fix, but a strange, silent knowing that this is where it begins. The pain is real, but so is the way through. The return. Addiction is not who you are. It's what you reached for when you forgot who you were. It's the voice that said, "Let me carry this pain for you." And for a while, it did. It numbed the grief. It silenced the scream. It gave you something to hold on to when everything else felt too far away. But now you see it. Now you know, and you can't unknow it. The path forward is not about cutting off the habit like a dead limb. It's about returning to the part of you that has been waiting all this time. The part that feels, the part that remembers, the part that wants more than just survival. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. You won't win this with force. You'll win it with honesty, with stillness, with breath, with sitting down, empty-handed, and saying, "I'm ready to stop running." That's how it begins. Not with fireworks, but with silence, with listening, with truth. You may still fall. That's okay. This is not about never craving again. It's about recognizing the craving for what it is, a signpost pointing inward. Every time you want to reach for the old fix, you get a new chance. A chance to ask, what do I actually need right now? And then, to offer it, not another numbing, but connection, with someone else, with nature, with your breath, with your pain, with the small, quiet self inside you who still believes you are worth coming home to. This has never been about addiction. This has always been about return. If something in this felt personal, if it echoed something you haven't been able to say out loud, I want to hear it. Tell me below. What did this bring up for you? What truth did it remind you of? And if you're ready to keep walking this path, subscribe. Not just for the next video, but to stay close to a space where people are choosing presence over escape, honesty over denial. You're not the only one on this journey. You never were.